Hi everyone, my name is Joseph Liang, and I am an adult endocrinologist affiliated with UBC and Vancouver General Hospital, although all the views here are my own. Today I'll be discussing the topic, why is there no generic insulin? And this talk is based on an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine around 10 years ago of the same name. I initially presented this talk at an academic half-day session back in 2017. So the objectives are to review a brief history of insulin, to demonstrate the differences in structure and function of different types of insulin, and to discuss reasons why there is no generic insulin, or maybe there is. So first off, a few quiz questions. In what year was insulin discovered? 1869, 1921, 1922, 1923, or 1936? So take a moment to think about this a little bit, commit to an answer, and then we'll move on to the next question, and we'll review the answers for all the quiz questions at the very end. Question number 2, insulin is an amine hormone, an eicosanoid hormone, a peptide hormone, a protein hormone, or a steroid hormone? So think about that one. And then lastly, insulin detamere is an insulin analog with 3 altered amino acids, an insulin analog with a bound carboxylic acid, an insulin analog with a bound fatty acid, regular insulin mixed with protamine and zinc, or 3 times concentrated insulin. So think about that. So we're going to jump right in and talk about why this is even a discussion that we're having. So insulin was discovered more than 100 years ago now, but no generic insulin is available, or maybe there is. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Even though there is this Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act passed in 1984, so-called generic insulin is still not available. These figures might be a little bit dated, but back in 2015, when this article was published by Green and Riggs in the New England Journal of Medicine, 21 million people live with diabetes in the United States, 6 million of whom use insulin. In Canada, that number is around 2.4 million who live with diabetes. And the out-of-pocket costs for insulin range somewhere from $120, $140 per month for an uninsured patient, for example. Of course, it can vary depending on how much insulin an individual is using, but that's just to give an idea of the cost. So if insulin was discovered in 1921, why is there no generic insulin? Well, in order to answer this question, we need to look back at the history of development of insulin. And what this gets into is a bit of applied biochemistry, some health economics, and applying that to our clinical knowledge as well. So a brief history of insulin. In 1921, it was Banting and Best who serendipitously discovered insulin, and they extracted this active insulin from an animal pancreas. It was a year after that where Leonard Thompson, a 14-year-old boy, he became the first patient to be treated with insulin. Fast forward more than 20 years later, Hans Christian Hagedorn and his colleagues at what was to become Novo Nordisk, they patent a longer acting form of insulin that could be mixed with shorter acting insulin. And so they called this NPH, which stands for neutral protamine Hagedorn. And then fast forward another over 20 years, Genentech produces the first recombinant DNA human insulin. So that would be Humulin R and Humulin N. And then a few years after that, Lilly brings recombinant insulins to market. A few years later, Novo Nordisk markets its first recombinant insulins. And then the next decade, Lispro becomes the first short-acting insulin analog to be approved. Aspart soon follows, then glulisine. And then we also get in that decade glargine becoming the first long-acting insulin analog to be approved. We see Detamir, and then finally in 2014, the first patents on these insulin analogs expires. So just to review a little bit of the types of insulin. So there's long-acting insulins and short-acting insulins. So the first one that was discovered is regular insulin. There's different brands. One of them is Humulin R. There's Novolin R, for example, as well. And it peaks around 2 to 4 hours after it's administered and lasts 4 to 6 hours. The next one that was discovered is NPH, Humulin N, Novolin N. There's other brands as well, but it peaks around 8 hours after it's administered and lasts for around 18 hours. And then these are the insulin analogs that come after that. So there's Lispro, Aspart, and glulisine. They all peak in that kind of 1 to 2, 1 to 3 hour range, and they last for around 3 to 5 hours. Then after that, we see the more longer acting insulins, such as glargine, Detamir, and Degludec, that come onto market. Typically, we think of them as having no real peak, and they last longer. So for glargine, it lasts for 24 hours. Levemir, a little bit shorter than that. Degludec, it's longer, so around 40 hours. It's really still designed to be taken daily, though, not every 2 days. And then there are some newer insulins. Now we're in 2025. We have icodec, also known as a weekly, and then there's also something called FC Tora. So these have come onto market / will be coming onto the market. And we're not going to give that too much discussion today, but this is just to give you a flavor of the different types of insulins and also what makes these insulins different. So this is a diagram that relates to the onset of action, the peaking, and how long these insulins last, corresponding to the last slide. And then this is a really good review as well. I'd encourage you to download it, to view it if you can, because it gives the structures of these different types of insulins. So as you can see here, NPH insulin is actually the native human insulin structure, but they add protamine and zinc molecules in a neutral pH, and that's why it's called neutral protamine Hagedorn for that longer acting insulin. Then for insulin glargine, there are some modifications to the amino acid sequence here, and that's why this is called an insulin analog. Insulin detamir has this fatty acid chain bound to it that makes it last longer. And likewise, insulin degludec has this longer fatty acid chain, which makes it last even longer. For the short-acting insulins, we have, once again, here there's regular insulin, also known as Toronto, and that's just the native amino acid chain. And then we have these different insulin analogs, which make these rapid-acting insulins. And there's a number of different amino acid changes here. So for example, Lispro is where they have swapped the lysine and proline amino acid residues, which is the reason why it's called Lispro. And likewise, in Aspart, you can see here that amino acid 28 on the B chain has been swapped from a proline to an aspartate. And then in glulicine, what we can see here is there's a glutamate and lysine amino acid residue that have been swapped. And that's what make these insulin analogs more rapid acting. So once we have discussed this biochemistry, the question is, why is there no generic insulin? Well, what we have seen from the development of history over the last 100 years or so is that every 20, 30 years or so, there is some kind of continued pharmacologic advancement in the development, in the marketing of these insulins. And so the drug companies hold exclusive patent rights on these new insulins, these new types of insulins. And so therefore, generic companies haven't been able to catch up that way. And the moment a patent expires, then a new product comes onto market. Insulin is a relatively large molecule, and it's hard to reproduce by generic drug companies. So, if you were in an OChem lab and you tried to synthesize some smaller organic molecules, it's easier to produce. There are some sugar substitutes. If you look online, you can actually produce some of them. Maybe even at home, although probably you shouldn't try it. Um, but insulin, not possible. So if you compare, for example, the structure of insulin, there's a crystal structure over here. It is pretty complicated, as you can see. Whereas if you compare it to a molecule like a metformin, I'm not saying that you can produce this in at home or anything like that, but it's certainly much more simple compared to insulin. So this is one of the reasons why it's hard for generic companies to produce such a huge molecule, whereas metformin is much easier to produce by a generic company, for example. So another complicating factor is this concept called biosimilars. So for medications that have complicated structures, complicated crystal structures, biosimilar medications have been a way of producing these molecules more cheaply and with less kind of stringent regulations. So in countries like China, India, Mexico, and Peru, they're able to produce biosimilar medications at a cheaper price. A really big example of this is in biologics. So a lot of rheumatologic medications, for example, the original company might produce that monoclonal antibody that looks kind of like this. But some of these biosimilar companies, they may produce pretty much the similar kind of molecule, but there may just slight alterations in certain side chains that do not alter the function of the medication at all. And so there are now companies that are producing these kind of interchangeable insulins or biosimilar insulins starting in 2016. And that's where, example, the first one was Glargine, the brand name there, Lantus. There are some of these kind of interchangeable insulins now being produced. So Basaglar is one of those examples. And the cost of these to the consumer would be around 20 to 30% less expensive. And so these are now being favored as the insulins of choice for individuals who require these medications. Other companies have also been now producing biosimilars and interchangeable insulins, and so there is more market competition now. Now, for some of those rheumatologic drugs I mentioned, oftentimes the cost savings is quite substantial. It can be, up to 80% in some cases. Unfortunately for insulins, it's not as much of a benefit, but still 20 to 40% is not insignificant. And so nowadays there are these biosimilars or interchangeable insulins, and I guess this is as close as we'll get to a generic insulin. So we can think about these biosimilars as basically like generic insulins. The other thing is that to remember is that insulin is not a single entity, but it's a family of medications. It has underwent incremental innovation. And so because of this, the life cycle is not like other drugs in terms of the development. And so as older insulins become obsolete, there are these newer insulins and newer innovations. And case in point, insulin detamere, the brand name is Levemir, that will be actually discontinued worldwide in a matter of months. So, but then, as I mentioned, there's these new insulins that are coming onto market, such as icodec, brand name is a weekly. As the patents on insulin analogs expire, there are these kind of biosimilar or interchangeable insulin companies. They're finally taking this step to produce these cheaper insulins for patients and consumers. So the cost decrease is certainly going to be beneficial and much appreciated. And hopefully this can help with patient compliance outcomes to better our healthcare systems as well. So to get back to our quiz questions, in what year was insulin discovered? That would be 1921, as I mentioned. Insulin is a peptide hormone. It is comprised of two chains of amino acid residues, the A chain and the B chain, with that C peptide being cleaved off in the process going from proinsulin to insulin. And then lastly, insulin detamere. It is an insulin analog with a bound fatty acid, but as I mentioned, it will be discontinued very shortly. So we've gone through these objectives to review a brief history of insulin, to demonstrate the differences in structure and function of these different types of insulin, and also to discuss the reasons why there are no generic insulins, but rather these biosimilars or interchangeable insulins. That's really what we're thinking as the basically generic equivalent of insulin. Thank you very much.